The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., shattering the silence of Detective Sarah Chin's apartment like glass breaking against concrete. In her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, she had learned that calls at this hour meant only one thing. Someone was dead, missing, or both. What she didn't expect was that this particular call would lead her down the darkest rabbit hole of her career, into a world where reality bent like light through a prism, and where the line between sanity and madness became as thin as a violin string stretched to its breaking point. "Chen here," she answered, her voice cutting through the darkness with practiced authority. "Detective, we need you downtown. Carnegie Hall. We've got a situation that—" The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had seen everything the city could throw at him. But tonight, his usually steady voice trembled like leaves in a storm. "Ma'am, you're going to want to see this yourself. I can't even begin to explain it over the phone." Sarah was already reaching for her clothes, muscle memory taking over as her mind raced through possibilities. Carnegie Hall meant high profile, which meant media attention, which meant the brass would be breathing down everyone's necks before the sun came up. "Give me something, Martinez. What are we dealing with?" "It's Anastasia Volkov, the Russian violinist. She was supposed to perform tonight. Sold-out show, 2,000 people in the audience." "But detective—" Martinez paused, and Sarah could hear him swallow hard. "She vanished right there on stage, in front of everyone. 1 second she was playing, the next second she was just gone. And that's not even the strangest part." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through her apartment windows. Anastasia Volkov was one of the world's most celebrated violinists, a prodigy who had risen from the poverty-stricken streets of Moscow to become an international sensation. Her story was the stuff of fairy tales. A young girl found playing a broken violin in a subway station, discovered by a wealthy patron who recognized her extraordinary talent and sponsored her education at the most prestigious music schools in Europe. "What's the strangest part, Martinez?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The violin. She left it behind. But it's not right, detective. Though it looks like it's been aged 100 years in the past hour. And there are marks carved into it that weren't there before. Symbols. Ancient-looking stuff that gives me the creeps just looking at it." Sarah was already halfway out the door, her service weapon secured in its holster, badge clipped to her belt. "Don't let anyone touch that violin. I mean anyone, Martinez. Set up a perimeter and keep the witnesses separated. I'll be there in 15 minutes. As she drove through the empty streets toward Manhattan, Sarah's mind began working the case like a puzzle, sorting through the logical possibilities. Stage magic gone wrong. Elaborate publicity stunt? Mental breakdown leading to a hiding place somewhere in the massive venue? She had worked missing persons cases before, and they almost always had mundane explanations. People didn't just vanish into thin air, especially not in front of 2,000 witnesses. But as her patrol car pulled up in front of Carnegie Hall, Sarah felt the first stirrings of doubt. The historic building was blazing with lights. Police vehicles lined the street like a funeral procession, and even at this early hour, news vans were beginning to circle like vultures. This was bigger than a simple missing person case. The first thing that struck her as she entered the famous concert hall was the silence. 2,000 people had been evacuated, but their presence seemed to linger in the air like smoke. The red velvet seats sat empty, but Sarah could almost hear the echo of their collective gasp, the moment when reality had shifted and left everyone questioning what they had actually witnessed. Martinez met her at the stage entrance, his weathered face pale under the harsh work lights that had been set up by the crime scene team. "Detective Chin, thank God you're here. This whole thing has got everyone spooked." "Show me the violin," Sarah said, all business. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle the impossible was to focus on the evidence, to ground herself in the tangible details that couldn't lie or play tricks on the mind. The instrument lay on the stage exactly where Anastasia had been standing when she disappeared. At first glance, it looked like any other high-end violin, the kind that cost more than most people's houses. But as Sarah knelt beside it, slipping on latex gloves, she began to understand Martinez's unease. The wood, which should have been a rich, warm brown, had darkened to an almost black hue. The varnish, typically smooth and glossy on a professional instrument, was cracked and weathered as if it had been exposed to decades of extreme weather. Most disturbing were the symbols that had appeared along the neck and body of the violin, intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and shift when Sarah wasn't looking directly at them. "Has anyone touched this?" she asked, carefully photographing the instrument from every angle. The concertmaster, David Kowalski, picked it up right after she vanished. Said it nearly burned his fingers. We've got his statement, but Detective Martinez lowered his voice. The guy's been playing violin for 30 years, and he swears this isn't the same instrument Anastasia was playing when she started her performance. Sarah filed this information away as she continued her examination. The symbols were definitely not European in origin. They looked more like Sanskrit or some other ancient script. One in particular caught her attention, a serpent-like figure that seemed to be swallowing its own tail, carved into the area just below the chin rest. I need to talk to the witnesses, Sarah said, standing and brushing dust off her knees. Starting with whoever was closest to the stage when it happened. Martinez led her to a rehearsal room where they had set up a makeshift interview area. The first witness was Emma Richardson, a music student from Juilliard who had been sitting in the front row center, close enough to see every detail of the performance. Emma was young, maybe 22, with the intense, focused demeanor of someone who had dedicated their life to their art. But her hands shook as she accepted the coffee Martinez offered, and her eyes had the glazed look of someone who had seen something that challenged everything they believed about reality. Miss Richardson, Sarah began gently, I know this has been traumatic, but I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Every detail, no matter how strange it might seem. Emma took a shaky sip of coffee before beginning. Anastasia came out at exactly 8 o'clock. She was wearing a black evening gown. Her hair was up in a chignon, and she was carrying the Stradivarius. Everyone knew about the violin. It's famous. She took her position at center stage and began with Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor. She played the first movement perfectly, and then she started the chaconne. Sarah made notes as Emma spoke, but she could see the young woman's composure beginning to crack as she approached the crucial moment. The chaconne is incredibly difficult, Emma continued. It's like the Mount Everest of violin music. But Anastasia was playing it like it was child's play, better than I've ever heard it played before. The sound was so pure, so perfect, that it almost hurt to listen to. And then what, Emma? The music changed. I mean, she was still playing Bach, but it was like she was playing something underneath it. Something darker. The melody was the same, but there was this other sound woven into it. Like whispers, or maybe like screaming, but so faint you almost couldn't hear it. Sarah leaned forward. This was the first she was hearing about any unusual sounds. Did other people hear this too? I don't know. I was so focused on her playing that I didn't look around. But Detective, that's when things got really strange. The violin started to glow. Glow. Just faintly at first, like there was a light inside the wood. And Anastasia's eyes, they were closed, but not like she was concentrating. More like she was in a trance. Her playing became more and more intense, and the glow got brighter. And then, just as she reached the climax of the piece, Emma stopped, her face going white. Sarah waited patiently, knowing that pushing too hard would only make the witness clam up. She screamed. Emma finally whispered. Right in the middle of playing, she opened her eyes and screamed. But it wasn't her voice. It was like multiple voices all screaming at once. And then there was this flash of light, so bright it was like looking into the sun. When my vision cleared, she was gone. Just gone. But the violin was still there, and it looked like it had been buried in the ground for a century. Sarah finished taking Emma's statement and moved on to the next witness, then the next. The stories were remarkably consistent, which in her experience was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Either she was dealing with a genuine mystery, or she had stumbled into the most elaborate hoax in criminal history. By dawn, Sarah had interviewed dozens of witnesses, and the pattern was always the same. Anastasia had been playing beautifully. The music had taken on an otherworldly quality. There had been a flash of light, and then she was gone. Several witnesses mentioned hearing voices in the music, and at least 6 people claimed they had seen symbols or writing appear in the air above the stage during the performance. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Sarah found herself back on the stage, staring at the violin and trying to make sense of what she had learned. The crime scene team had finished their work, and the instrument had been carefully packaged for transport to the lab, but she knew in her gut that science wasn't going to provide the answers she needed. Her phone rang, and she saw the caller ID showed Detective Lieutenant James Harrison, her supervisor and one of the few people in the department she truly trusted. Chen, what the hell is going on over there? I've got the mayor's office calling. The Russian consulate is demanding answers, and the media is going crazy with theories about everything from alien abduction to terrorist attacks. Lieutenant, I've never seen anything like this. We have 2,000 witnesses, all telling the same impossible story. Either we're dealing with the most sophisticated illusion ever created, or what, detective? Sarah took a deep breath. In her entire career, she had never been one to believe in supernatural explanations. She was a facts and evidence cop, someone who solved cases through methodical investigation and logical deduction. But standing on that stage, surrounded by the lingering sense of something profoundly wrong, she found herself considering possibilities she would have dismissed as fantasy just 24 hours earlier. I don't know, sir, but I think we need to dig deeper into Anastasia Volkov's background. Something tells me this case is going to take us places we've never been before. As it turned out, Sarah's instincts were more accurate than she could have imagined. The investigation into Anastasia Volkov's disappearance would take her from the concert halls of New York to the ancient monasteries of Tibet, from the archives of the Vatican to the laboratories of quantum physicists who studied the very nature of reality itself. It would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world, and ultimately force her to confront a truth so strange and terrible that she would spend the rest of her career trying to forget it. But that morning, standing in Carnegie Hall with the October sun streaming through the windows and the impossible violin safely sealed in an evidence bag, Sarah Chun had no idea that she was about to become part of a story that stretched back thousands of years, involving secret societies, ancient curses, and instruments of power that had been hidden from the world for good reason. The first breakthrough came 3 days later, when the lab results on the violin came back. Dr. Marcus Webb, the department's forensic specialist, called Sarah personally to discuss the findings. Detective Chun, I've been doing this job for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like this, Webb said, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. The carbon dating puts the wood at approximately 300 years old, which is consistent with a genuine Stradivarius. But here's where it gets weird. The aging appears to have happened recently. Very recently. What do you mean? I mean that at the cellular level, this would show signs of having been rapidly aged through some kind of process I can't identify. It's as if someone took a normal piece of 300-year-old wood and subjected it to centuries of additional wear in a matter of hours. The chemical composition has changed, the cellular structure has degraded, and those symbols you photographed? They're not carved into the wood, detective. They're grown into it. Sarah felt that familiar chill again. Grown. The wood fibers have actually rearranged themselves to form those patterns. It's biologically impossible, but there it is under the microscope. And detective, the symbols are still moving. Moving. Slowly, but yes. The patterns are shifting and changing even as we watch them. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Sarah hung up the phone and immediately began researching everything she could find about the violin's history. According to the insurance documents, the instrument was one of only 600 violins made by Antonio Stradivari in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This particular violin, known as the Moscow Angel, had a fascinating and tragic history. The violin had originally been commissioned in 1704 by Count Vladimir Orlov, a Russian nobleman who was reportedly obsessed with the occult. According to historical records, Orlov had specifically requested that Stradivari incorporate certain materials into the varnish, materials that the Count claimed would give the instrument supernatural resonance. Stradivari, who was known for his innovative techniques, apparently agreed to the unusual request. The violin had passed through several owners over the centuries, and Sarah noticed a disturbing pattern. Every single previous owner had either died under mysterious circumstances or had simply vanished without a trace. The most recent case was particularly chilling. In 1987, a violinist named Viktor Petrov had been performing in Moscow when he suddenly stopped mid-performance, claimed he could hear voices in the wood, and then walked off stage and was never seen again. The trail of the violin's ownership led Sarah to Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a musicologist at Columbia University who specialized in the history of Stradivarius instruments. Dr. Hartwell agreed to meet with Sarah at her office, a cluttered room filled with photographs of ancient instruments and books on music history that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Detective Chun, Dr. Hartwell said as she poured tea from an antique service set, I've been expecting someone to ask about the Moscow Angel for years. I'm frankly surprised it took this long. You know about the violin's history? Oh, I know more than just its history. I know what it really is. Dr. Hartwell settled into her chair, her eyes taking on the intense focus of someone about to share a closely guarded secret. That instrument is not just a violin, detective. It's what occultists call a resonance anchor. a physical object that has been designed to bridge the gap between our reality and other realities. Sarah set down her teacup carefully. Dr. Hartwell, I appreciate your expertise, but I'm a police detective investigating a missing person case. I need facts, not theories about the supernatural. Detective, I have a PhD in music history from Harvard and another in theoretical physics from MIT. I don't traffic in theories. I deal in documented phenomena that mainstream science isn't ready to acknowledge yet. Dr. Hartwell stood and pulled a thick file from her bookshelf. Count Orloff wasn't just obsessed with the occult. He was a member of a secret society called the Order of the Resonant Key. They believed that certain combinations of sound frequencies could open doorways to other dimensions. Sarah found herself leaning forward despite her skepticism. Other dimensions? Think of it like this. Our universe exists at a specific vibrational frequency, but there are infinite other frequencies, other realities existing parallel to ours. The Order believed that by creating instruments tuned to precise harmonic intervals, they could travel between these realities. And you think that's what happened to Anastasia Volkov? Dr. Hartwell opened the file and spread several documents across her desk. Sarah recognized photocopies of historical texts, scientific papers, and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams of musical notation mixed with mathematical formulas. I think Anastasia inadvertently activated a mechanism that had been dormant for decades. Look at this. Dr. Hartwell pointed to a particular document. This is a letter from Stradivari himself to Count Orloff, dated 1704. He describes the process of creating the violin in detail. The wood came from a tree that grew in a monastery in Tibet, a tree that the monks claimed was over 1,000 years old and had absorbed the prayers of 10,000 souls. The varnish contained ground pearls, silver dust, and something Stradivari calls the essence of the between spaces. Sarah examined the letter, noting the formal Italian script and the aged parchment. If it was a forgery, it was an incredibly sophisticated one. What is the essence of the between spaces? I spent 15 years trying to figure that out. My best guess is that it refers to a substance that exists in a quantum state, neither fully in our reality nor fully outside it. Count Orloff claimed he had acquired it from Tibetan monks who practiced a form of meditation that allowed them to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Despite her rational mind's protests, Sarah found herself becoming caught up in the professor's explanation. The evidence was strange enough that traditional investigative methods weren't yielding results, and she was running out of conventional leads to follow. Dr. Hartwell, assuming for a moment that any of this is true, what would it mean for my investigation? How do I find someone who has supposedly been transported to another dimension? That's the million-dollar question, detective. The Order of the Resonant Key believed that the dimensional barriers were thinnest at certain times and places. They created maps, charts showing when and where these resonance points would be most active. If I'm right about what happened to Anastasia Volkov, she might be accessible during specific windows of opportunity. Dr. Hartwell pulled out another document, a complex chart that looked like a cross between an astrological map and a subway schedule. According to this, the next optimal resonance point in the New York area will occur in 3 days, at exactly 11:47 p.m., at a location in Central Park. Sarah studied the chart, noting the precise astronomical calculations and geographic coordinates. Even if she didn't believe in dimensional travel, she had to admit that someone had put an enormous amount of thought and effort into creating these documents. What happens at a resonance point, she asked. If the Order's theories were correct, it becomes possible to communicate across the dimensional barrier, maybe even to facilitate a return journey, if the person on the other side is still conscious and able to respond to the right frequency signals. Sarah made her decision. It wasn't based on logic or evidence or any of the principles she had learned in 20 years of police work. It was based on intuition and on the growing certainty that conventional investigation methods weren't going to solve this case. Dr. Hartwell, I need you to show me everything you know about these resonance points. And I need to understand exactly what kind of equipment we would need to attempt communication. 3 days later, Sarah found herself standing in Central Park at 11:30 p.m. with Dr. Hartwell, a collection of electronic equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, and a growing sense that she had crossed a line from investigation into something that could easily end her career. Dr. Hartwell had assembled what she called a harmonic resonance array, a combination of speakers, frequency generators, and recording equipment that could produce and detect sound frequencies far beyond the range of human hearing. The professor had also brought along a reproduction of Count Orloff's original resonance charts, updated with modern astronomical data. Detective, I want you to understand that we're entering completely uncharted territory here, Dr. Hartwell said as she calibrated the equipment. Even if the Order's theories were correct, we have no idea what kind of dangers might be involved in attempting interdimensional communication. Sarah checked her service weapon and made sure her radio was working properly. She had called in her location to dispatch, officially logging this as a follow-up investigation at a potential crime scene. If things went wrong, at least there would be a record of where she had been and what she had been attempting. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Dr. Hartwell activated the resonance array. The equipment began generating a series of tones so low that Sarah felt them more than heard them, vibrations that seemed to travel through the ground and up through her bones. The professor monitored a series of displays, adjusting frequencies and amplitudes according to formulas copied from 300-year-old documents. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Sarah began to feel foolish, standing in Central Park in the middle of the night with electronic equipment and a university professor, chasing theories that belonged in fantasy novels rather than police reports. Then the air in front of them began to shimmer. At first, Sarah thought it was just heat distortion from the electronic equipment. But as the shimmering intensified, she realized she was looking at something far more profound. The space in front of the resonance array was bending, twisting, as if reality itself was being stretched like fabric. Dr. Hartwell, Sarah whispered, "What is that?" I think it's working, Detective. The dimensional barrier is becoming permeable at this location." Through the shimmering distortion, Sarah began to make out shapes, vague at first, but gradually becoming clearer. It was like looking through water or through the heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but slowly the images began to resolve into recognizable forms. She saw a landscape that looked like Central Park, but wrong somehow. The trees were the same species, but they were arranged differently. The paths were in the wrong places. And the sky was the color of deep ocean water, with stars arranged in patterns that didn't match any constellation Sarah had ever seen. And walking along one of those wrong-place paths, still wearing her black evening gown from the Carnegie Hall performance, was Anastasia Volkov. "Anastasia," Sarah shouted, forgetting all caution in her excitement at finally locating the missing woman. "Anastasia, can you hear me?" The figure in the evening gown stopped walking and turned toward the shimmering distortion. Even through the dimensional barrier, Sarah could see the confusion and fear in the woman's eyes. Anastasia approached slowly, reaching out tentatively toward the area where reality was bent and twisted. "Who are you?" Anastasia's voice came through strangely, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Where am I? What happened to me? My name is Detective Sarachon with the NYPD. You disappeared during your performance at Carnegie Hall 3 days ago. We've been looking for you ever since." 3 days? Anastasia looked around at the alien landscape with growing panic. "It feels like I've been here for months. This place. Detective, this place is wrong. The sun never rises, but it never gets completely dark either. And there are things here. Things that watch from the shadows and whisper in languages I've never heard before." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, speaking urgently. "Anastasia, listen to me carefully. You're in what we call a parallel dimension, a reality that exists alongside ours, but with different physical laws. The violin you were playing had been modified to act as a dimensional transport device. When you played the right combination of notes, it opened a gateway and pulled you through." The violin. Anastasia's eyes widened with realization. "I remember now. The music, it started playing itself. I couldn't stop my fingers from moving. And there were voices singing along, but not human voices. Ancient voices, speaking words I understood but had never learned." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. "Anastasia, we're going to try to bring you back. But I need you to tell me, are you alone there? Are there other people?" Anastasia looked around nervously before answering. "Not people, Detective, but there are others. They look human from a distance, but when they get close, you can see that they're wrong somehow. Their movements are too fluid. Their eyes reflect light like an animal's, and they sing constantly. Songs that make your teeth ache and your dreams turn dark." "We need to get her out of there," Sarah said to Dr. Hartwell. "How do we reverse the process?" Dr. Hartwell was frantically consulting her charts and adjusting the frequency generators. According to the Order's documents, the process should be reversible, but it requires precise harmonic alignment, and we only have a limited window before the resonance point shifts and the barrier solidifies again. As if in response to her words, the shimmering distortion began to flicker and fade. The image of Anastasia and the alien landscape became less distinct, like a television signal breaking up. The connection is weakening. Dr. Hartwell shouted over the increasing hum of the equipment. Anastasia, you need to move closer to the barrier. Try to step through where the air is shimmering. But as Anastasia approached the dimensional boundary, something emerged from the shadows behind her. Sarah got only a glimpse of it, something tall and pale that moved with unnatural grace, with too many joints in its limbs and eyes that burned like cold fire. The thing reached out toward Anastasia with fingers that were too long and ended in points that might have been claws or might have been surgical instruments. Behind you, Sarah screamed, drawing her service weapon instinctively, even though she knew bullets would be useless against something in another dimension. Anastasia spun around and saw the creature approaching. She screamed and ran toward the dimensional barrier, but the thing was faster. It caught her by the arm, and its touch left marks on her skin that looked like frostbite mixed with radiation burns. The creature spoke, and its voice came through the dimensional barrier like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the sound of breaking glass. She belongs to us now. She played the forbidden music. She opened the door. The compact is sealed. What compact? Sarah shouted back. What are you talking about? But the creature was dragging Anastasia away from the barrier, back into the shadows of the alien landscape. The connection was fading rapidly, and Dr. Hartwell's equipment was beginning to overload from the strain of maintaining the interdimensional link. Anastasia, Sarah called one last time. We'll find another way. We'll bring you home. And then the connection severed. The air stopped shimmering. The electronic equipment fell silent, and Sarah found herself standing in perfectly normal Central Park at midnight, with no evidence that anything extraordinary had happened except for the lingering taste of ozone in the air and the memory of something that challenged everything she thought she knew about reality. Dr. Hartwell was already packing up the equipment, her face grim. Detective, we need to get out of here. Interdimensional contact sometimes attracts attention from things that are better left alone. As they loaded the equipment into Sarah's car, Dr. Hartwell continued her explanation. Based on what we just witnessed, I think Anastasia has become involved in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple dimensional displacement. That creature mentioned a compact and forbidden music. If I'm right, this goes back to the original creation of the violin and Count Orloff's dealings with the Order of the Resonant Key. What kind of compact? Sarah asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. The Order's documents mentioned something called the Agreement of Echoes, a treaty between our reality and certain entities from parallel dimensions. According to the texts, these entities were given permission to claim anyone who played specific musical sequences on instruments that had been modified with interdimensional resonance capabilities. Sarah felt sick. So Anastasia was essentially traded away? Sold to these creatures? It's worse than that, Detective. The agreement wasn't just about individual musicians. It was about opening permanent gateways between the dimensions. Every person who gets taken, every time one of these modified instruments is played, the barriers between realities become a little thinner. The Order believed they were conducting scientific experiments, but they were actually facilitating an invasion. As they drove back toward Manhattan, Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Dr. Hartwell was right, then Anastasia's disappearance was just the beginning. There were other modified instruments out there, other potential victims, and a growing threat to the stability of reality itself. Dr. Hartwell, I need you to give me everything you have on the Order of the Resonant Key. Names, locations, historical records, everything. If these creatures are planning some kind of invasion, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Detective, you're talking about a conspiracy that spans 3 centuries and involves some of the most powerful people in history. The Order had members in royal courts, major universities, and even within the Catholic Church. This isn't something that can be solved with traditional police work. Sarah's jaw tightened with determination. Then we'll have to find a non-traditional solution. Anastasia Volkov is still my case, and I'm not giving up on her. Over the next several weeks, Sarah dove deeper into the mystery than any rational detective should have. She took vacation time and used her own resources to travel to archives and libraries across the country, following leads that would have seemed insane to anyone outside the investigation. The paper trail led her to the Smithsonian Institution, where Dr. Amanda Foster, the curator of the musical instrument collection, had been quietly investigating similar cases for over a decade. Dr. Foster revealed that there were at least 12 known instruments worldwide that showed signs of interdimensional modification: violins, cellos, pianos, and even a harp that had been linked to mysterious disappearances throughout history. Detective Chun, Dr. Foster said as they stood in the climate-controlled storage facility beneath the Smithsonian, "I've been waiting for someone like you for years. Someone with the authority to investigate these cases officially. The academic world treats this as folklore, law enforcement dismisses it as fantasy, but people keep disappearing." Sarah examined the instruments in the collection, noting the same weathered appearance and strange symbols that she had seen on the Moscow Angel violin. "How many people have vanished?" "That we know of?" 47, spanning from 1704 to the present. But I suspect the actual number is much higher. These instruments have a way of finding their way to musicians who have the particular combination of skill and sensitivity needed to activate their interdimensional properties. And there's no way to reverse the process? No way to bring these people back. Dr. Foster led Sarah to a particular display case containing what appeared to be a normal grand piano, except for the intricate symbols carved into its soundboard and the fact that several of the keys appeared to be made of some kind of crystalline material rather than ivory. There might be. The order's documents mentioned something called the conductor's key, a master instrument that was supposedly capable of controlling all the other modified instruments. If we could locate it, we could potentially open and close dimensional barriers at will, Sarah finished. Where is it? That's the million-dollar question, Detective. The last reliable sighting was in 1943, during the siege of Leningrad. A Wehrmacht officer named Klaus Zimmermann reportedly acquired it from the Hermitage Museum, but he disappeared before the end of the war. The instrument hasn't been seen since. Sarah's investigation took on new urgency as she realized the scope of what she was dealing with. She reached out to Interpol, sharing her findings with international law enforcement agencies and discovering that similar cases had been reported in cities around the world. A cellist had vanished during a performance in Vienna. A pianist had disappeared from the stage of the Sydney Opera House. A harpist had simply walked off stage in the middle of a concert in London and had never been seen again. The pattern was always the same. A world-class musician performing on an instrument with an unusual history, a performance that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities, and then a disappearance that defied all logical explanation. But it was a phone call from Moscow that changed everything. Detective Inspector Yuri Volkov, Anastasia's brother, and himself a member of the Russian Federal Police, had been conducting his own investigation into his sister's disappearance. What he had discovered made Sarah's blood run cold. "Detective Chun," Yuri said in heavily accented English, "I have found records that suggest the disappearances are not random. There is pattern, a schedule. Every instrument is being activated according to specific astronomical alignments, and always in major cultural centers around the world." "What kind of schedule?" "According to documents I found in old KGB archives, the Order of the Resonant Key believed that opening multiple dimensional barriers simultaneously, at precisely calculated intervals, would create what they called a resonance cascade, a chain reaction that would permanently merge our reality with the parallel dimensions." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. They're not just taking individual people. They're preparing for something much bigger. Exactly. And Detective, according to my calculations, the next phase of their plan is set to occur in exactly 2 weeks, during the winter solstice. If they succeed, the dimensional barriers will collapse permanently, and our reality will be flooded with creatures from the parallel dimensions. Sarah hung up the phone and immediately began making calls. She reached out to every contact she had in law enforcement, academia, and even the military. The story she had to tell sounded insane, but the evidence was mounting, and she no longer had the luxury of worrying about her credibility or her career. Within 48 hours, she had assembled an unprecedented task force. Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Foster provided the historical and scientific expertise. Detective Inspector Volkov flew in from Moscow with additional research from the Russian archives. The FBI contributed technological resources and international coordination capabilities. Even the Vatican sent a representative, Father Michael Torres, a Jesuit priest who specialized in what the Church diplomatically referred to as unusual phenomena. The task force set up operations in a secure facility provided by the Department of Homeland Security. Their mission was simple in concept but staggering in scope. Locate the conductor's key, use it to reopen the dimensional barriers that had trapped the missing musicians, and prevent the resonance cascade that would merge realities and unleash an interdimensional invasion on Earth. They had 13 days to save not just Anastasia Volkov, but potentially all of human civilization. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Father Torres had been researching the Vatican's archives for any mention of Klaus Zimmermann, the Wehrmacht officer who had last been seen with the conductor's key. What he found was a confession letter written in 1945 by a dying German soldier who claimed to have helped Zimmermann hide the instrument in a bombed-out church in Berlin. The soldier's description is very specific, Father Torres explained to the task force. St. Catherine's Church, destroyed during the Allied bombing in 1944. But Zimmermann didn't just hide the instrument. He performed some kind of ritual that was supposed to bind the key to the sacred ground until it was needed again. Dr. Hartwell looked up from the frequency analysis she had been performing on recordings of the missing musicians' final performances. If Zimmermann understood the order's techniques, he might have created a temporal lock, a way of keeping the conductor's key in a state of dimensional suspension until specific conditions were met. What kind of conditions? Sarah asked. Most likely, the same conditions that would trigger the resonance cascade. The key would become accessible exactly when it was most needed to prevent the catastrophe. Within 6 hours, Sarah found herself on a military transport plane bound for Berlin, accompanied by half the task force and enough specialized equipment to stock a small laboratory. The German authorities had been briefed on the situation and had agreed to provide full cooperation. Though Sarah suspected, they thought the American investigators had all suffered collective nervous breakdowns. Berlin in December was cold and gray, but St. Catherine's Church was colder and grayer still. The building had been partially reconstructed after the war, but the original foundation and much of the basement level remained as Zimmermann had left them in 1945. Using ground-penetrating radar and Dr. Hartwell's resonance detection equipment, the team located what appeared to be a chamber beneath the church's altar. The chamber wasn't visible to normal senses. It existed in a state of dimensional phase shift, accessible only when the proper harmonic frequencies were generated. As Dr. Hartwell activated her equipment, and the familiar low-frequency vibrations began to make the air shimmer, Sarah felt the now-familiar sensation of reality bending around her. The stone floor beneath the altar became transparent, revealing a hidden room that existed between dimensions. And there, sitting on a simple wooden table in the center of the chamber, was an instrument unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The conductor's key appeared to be a hybrid between a piano and an organ, with multiple keyboards arranged in a complex geometric pattern. The keys themselves seemed to be made of crystallized sound. They were transparent, but reflected light in ways that created shifting patterns of color and shadow. The entire instrument hummed with barely contained energy, and the symbols carved into its surface moved and writhed like living things. "How do we get it out of there?" Sarah asked, staring at the impossible instrument. "Very carefully," Dr. Hartwell replied. "And we'll need someone who can play it." The order's documents make it clear that the conductor's key responds only to musicians who have the right combination of technical skill and psychic sensitivity. As if summoned by their conversation, Detective Inspector Yuri Volkov stepped forward. "I can play it," he said quietly. "I trained at the Moscow Conservatory before joining the police. And I have sensitivity to these things. It runs in my family." Sarah looked at the Russian detective with new understanding. That's why Anastasia was chosen, isn't it? She wasn't just talented. She had some kind of psychic ability that made her sensitive to the interdimensional properties of the violin. Yes, my grandmother was the same way. She could hear things in music that other people couldn't perceive. She always said that music was the language of the spaces between worlds. Working together, the team managed to extract the conductor's key from its dimensional hiding place and transport it to a secure location where Yuri could attempt to use it. Dr. Hartwell had spent days studying the order's operating manuals, and she believed she understood how to use the instrument to reopen the dimensional barriers and rescue the trapped musicians. But as Yuri sat down at the impossible keyboard and began to play, Sarah realized that they had underestimated the complexity of what they were attempting. The conductor's key wasn't just an instrument. It was a control panel for reality itself. As the crystalline keys responded to Yuri's touch, the air around them began to fracture into prismatic fragments, each one showing a different dimension, a different version of reality. Sarah saw glimpses of worlds where the laws of physics worked differently, where impossible geometries created landscapes that hurt to look at, and where creatures that had never been human danced to music that was older than civilization. "I can see her," Yuri called out over the rising harmonic chaos. "I can see Anastasia, but she's not alone. There are dozens of them. All the missing musicians, trapped in a place between dimensions." Through one of the prismatic fragments, Sarah could indeed see Anastasia Volkov, still wearing her black evening gown, but looking older and more worn than she had just weeks ago. She was part of a group of people who were playing instruments that glowed with the same eerie light as the Moscow Angel violin. They were performing some kind of complex musical composition, and their playing was keeping something at bay, something massive and dark that pressed against the boundaries of their dimensional prison. They're not just trapped, Dr. Hartwell said with growing horror. They're being used. The entities that took them are using their musical abilities to maintain the dimensional barriers while they prepare for the invasion. Then we free them, Sarah said with determination. Yuri, can you get them out? I can try, but Detective, if I break their dimensional prison, I might also release whatever it is they're holding back. Sarah looked at the fragments of reality swirling around them, at the impossible vistas of alien dimensions, at the creatures that pressed against the boundaries of their world like sharks circling wounded prey. She thought about all the missing musicians, about Anastasia Volkov playing a broken violin in a Moscow subway station, about the moment when reality had bent and twisted in Carnegie Hall. Do it, she said. Whatever the consequences, we can't leave them there. Yuri's fingers moved across the crystalline keys with increasing speed and complexity. The music that emerged from the conductor's key was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of creation and destruction happening simultaneously, of order and chaos finding perfect balance, of every song that had ever been written or ever would be written playing at the same time. The prismatic fragments grew larger and more stable, and Sarah could see the trapped musicians clearly now. They had become aware of the rescue attempt and were trying to move toward the dimensional barriers, but the dark presence that lurked at the edges of their prison was fighting back. The thing, Sarah could never adequately describe it, even in her official reports, was vast beyond comprehension, a creature of living shadow and malevolent intelligence that seemed to exist in all dimensions simultaneously. It had been using the musicians as a combination of prison guards and power source, keeping itself contained while it prepared for the moment when the dimensional barriers would weaken enough for it to break through into Earth's reality. As the barriers began to collapse, the creature made its move. Tendrils of living darkness shot through the prismatic fragments, reaching toward the conductor's key and the people operating it. Sarah drew her weapon, knowing it was useless but unwilling to go down without a fight. But the trapped musicians had other plans. Led by Anastasia Volkov, they began playing a countermelody to Yuri's composition, adding their own instruments' interdimensional resonance to the harmonic chaos. The combined music created something that Sarah could only describe as a sonic weapon, a sound so pure and powerful that it cut through the creature's defenses like a blade. The dark presence recoiled, its tendrils withdrawing, and in that moment of vulnerability, the dimensional barriers burst open like a dam breaking. Sarah felt reality reassert itself with an almost physical shock as 47 missing musicians tumbled out of interdimensional space and into the secure facility in Berlin. Anastasia collapsed into her brother's arms, and the other rescued people began to regain consciousness, looking around in confusion at their sudden return to normal reality. But even as Sarah celebrated the successful rescue, she knew that their victory was only temporary. The creature they had briefly confronted was still out there, still planning its invasion of Earth's reality. And there were still other modified instruments in the world, other potential gateways that could be exploited. Dr. Hartwell was already working with the conductor's key to seal the dimensional rifts that had been opened during the rescue operation, but she warned the task force that their work was far from over. This was just the beginning, she said as she monitored the harmonic stabilization readings. We've disrupted their immediate plans, but the entities behind this have been preparing for centuries. They'll adapt, find new approaches, create new instruments. Sarah looked at Anastasia Volkov, who was finally reunited with her brother, but still bore the psychological scars of her time in dimensional captivity. The young woman would need extensive therapy to recover from her experiences, and Sarah wondered if she would ever be able to play the violin again without triggering traumatic memories. So what do we do now? Sarah asked. Now we become guardians, Father Torres said. We monitor the modified instruments, we watch for signs of interdimensional activity, and we make sure that this never happens again. And so the task force evolved into a permanent organization, officially classified as a joint international law enforcement initiative focused on unusual criminal activities with potential national security implications. Sarah found herself promoted to head the organization's field operations, while Dr. Hartwell became the chief scientific advisor, and Father Torres handled liaison work with various government agencies that preferred not to admit they were dealing with interdimensional threats. The Moscow Angel violin was secured in a specially designed containment facility, along with the other modified instruments they had been able to locate and confiscate. The conductor's key was kept in a separate facility, available for emergency use, but protected by safeguards that would prevent its accidental activation. But late at night, when Sarah was alone in her office reviewing case files and monitoring reports from field agents around the world, she sometimes wondered if they had really won anything at all. The creatures were still out there, in dimensions parallel to Earth's reality, and they were patient in a way that human beings could never truly comprehend. Time would tell whether humanity had the wisdom and determination to protect itself from threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. But for now, at least, the music had stopped, the dimensional barriers were stable, and Anastasia Volkov was home. The case officially closed 6 months later, when the last of the rescued musicians had been debriefed and the modified instruments had been secured. Sarah's final report ran to over 500 pages and was immediately classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. But the real end of the story came on a quiet evening in spring, when Sarah received a personal invitation to a small, private concert in Carnegie Hall. Anastasia Volkov had spent months in therapy, working through the trauma of her interdimensional captivity, and had finally felt ready to perform again. The performance was simple, just Anastasia, a normal violin, and Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, the same piece she had been playing when she disappeared. But as Sarah listened from the audience, she was struck by how the music had changed. There was a depth to Anastasia's playing that hadn't been there before, a resonance that spoke of experiences beyond normal human understanding. When the performance ended, Sarah went backstage to congratulate the young violinist. Anastasia looked healthy and strong, though her eyes held shadows that would probably never entirely fade. "Detective Chun," Anastasia said, "thank you. For everything. For not giving up, for finding a way to bring us home." "I'm just glad you're safe," Sarah replied. Are you all right? Really all right?" Anastasia considered the question seriously. "I'm different. The things I saw, the music I heard in that place, it changed me. But I think maybe that's not entirely bad. I can hear harmonies now that I never noticed before. I can sense the connections between sounds and spaces in ways that make my music richer and more meaningful. And the nightmares? Getting better. Dr. Martinez says they'll probably never go away completely, but they're becoming less frequent. And sometimes I dream about the other musicians who are still out there, in other dimensions, waiting for someone to find them." Sarah felt a chill. Other musicians? "The 47 of us who were rescued weren't the only ones, Detective. We were just the most recent group. In that place between dimensions, I could sometimes hear echoes of older music, older voices. Musicians who had been taken decades, or even centuries ago, trapped in deeper levels of the dimensional maze." As Sarah left Carnegie Hall that night, walking through the familiar streets of Manhattan, she realized that her work was far from over. The task force had won an important victory, but the war against interdimensional threats would continue for the foreseeable future. Somewhere out there, in realities parallel to her own, ancient creatures were still plotting humanity's downfall. Modified instruments were still hidden in private collections and forgotten archives, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to reactivate their interdimensional properties. And talented musicians were still at risk of being pulled into dimensional traps by music that transcended the normal boundaries of reality. But Sarah Chun had learned something important during her investigation into Anastasia Volkov's disappearance. The human spirit was remarkably resilient, and the power of music, when used with wisdom and courage rather than reckless ambition, could be a force for protection rather than destruction. As she walked through the city night, Sarah found herself humming a simple melody, nothing complex or dangerous, just a tune her grandmother had sung to her when she was a child. It was a reminder that music, at its core, was about connection, communication, and hope. And sometimes, that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. The end.